Thanks to the Civic for exhibiting Northern Town. My name's Patrick Murphy, and I'm here with Anton Want. So we're having to do this via Zoom, so we apologise in advance of any sound qualities and issues, but we're doing the best we can. So what we thought we'd do is just give a quick visual introduction to the exhibition. These shots were taken by Anton. So have you got any thoughts immediately, Anton, of the image that we're seeing? So this is what people are greeted with, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. This is the entrance vestibule. So as you enter the gallery, there's some explanatory text, a little bit of background to the exhibition, and also a little taste of the work that you see as you go through the exhibition. It's kind of almost a one-way. It was a one-way exhibition anyway, in some ways, but obviously with the restrictions, galleries have to operate a one-way system. So you kind of turn to your left as you come into the space, and as you turn in, you kind of see the earlier decades that we kind of were interested in covering. So the period of the exhibition kind of runs from, it's the 60s, but it touches on the kind of 50s and the kind of work environment, the social environment of the times, and also how that was portrayed in film, television, writing, and the culture of the time, really, particularly in Northern England, where there was a lot of change, there was a lot of aspiration from the younger generations. That's kind of where Patrick and I come in, and we kind of, I suppose, are influenced by our parents' generation that grew up during that time when there was more aspiration, if you like, certainly for the lifestyle. People didn't stay living with their parents. They looked to get better jobs if they could, have better lives, have their own homes. And so for Patrick and I, it was a way of beginning to understand those influences on our work and our lives as you kind of go forward and grow into, like, become the generation of the 90s, 2000s, and start having children through that period.
Yeah, I think it was really nice, both of us being able to express our own lives and work through the filter of 20th century media outputs, whether it's literature or films. And I think from memory, that's kind of the early discussions around the idea of Northern Town, was that it was a personal view to a point. It was also intended to be almost a universal view, if there is such a thing, I don't know, but of a Northern Town that's been generated by other creatives as well, whether they're writers or directors or musicians, really. And it was interesting finding out whether there is that common thread through the decades.
Yeah, sorry, Patrick, we came into this project discussing ideas of the North and of Northern towns, and quite quickly realised that we could produce work that was specifically around one area based on the work of Barry Hines. So the work of Barry Hines and A Kestrel for a Knave and other writing from that period had a strong influence on how people saw the North, how they saw Barnsley in particular, and other writers like Alan Sillitoe. They had a big influence on the national perspective on what the North was at that time. And so for us, we spent the preceding kind of 3 or 4 years working with Barry Hines' archive and looking at the specifics of what the subjects that he covered. And that allowed us a way in, didn't it, Patrick, into this kind of, how do we look at it and make sense of it in a local sense, in this kind of Barnsley centric view, which has a wider universal appeal. And that was the way into us discussing wider topics about the North and how things have progressed now.
And it was interesting looking at how Hines had represented, although Barnsley's never really mentioned, but in things like Kes, you've got a really beautiful at times depiction of, the countryside in and around Barnsley, and also the hard reality of it as well. And it was that kind of dichotomy that really interested me, and I'm sure Anton as well, around how these two worlds almost exist. And I think Hines said himself that people are just not aware how beautiful the landscape is around an industrial area, really. People just, especially not so much now, but especially 60s, 70s, 80s, people saw it as a mining town and assumed that it was just grey skies, big chimneys, smokestacks, and it was that. But then again, it wasn't. You know, you had beautiful woods, beautiful landscape. And, Kes, I think, a synthesis of how he dealt with that idea of a northern town. You know, it can be both ugly and beautiful, really. And I think working on Heinz's archive, it allowed us to start thinking along similar ways, how both things can exist at the same time, really.
I mean, he for instance, Heinz covered the things that he saw around him. So he produced work on a gamekeeper, because he lived effectively on the edgelands of the borough of Barnsley. So he saw the countryside, and he also saw the town, and he also saw the industry, and grew up very much within the industry. And so he was able to reflect that in a very poetic way, but also capture the universal and the local, which had an appeal to an international audience. So, and that was the key, really, because if you, it becomes a bit of an echo chamber if you're just saying to people who already know, this is the North, that's the North. Actually, those things don't ring true. The truth is the individual experience and how it relates to like the wider world. So later on in the exhibition, we touch on what is the future for the North? How are the generations that are coming through now? What is their impression? Do they still hold on to those values? Is the world smaller now due to online activity and opportunity? But it does kind of feed into the nature of who you become if these things are in the background. I mean, for me, I've always, from a young age, been conscious of how the change to a place affects the future generations. So if for instance, an industry such as coal mining is so heavily influencing a borough because of the industrial migration, the job migration, which makes a town grow. When that's gone, how long does it take for those generations that come through to kind of let go of what's gone? Which is it's a really difficult thing. And the town itself, how long does it take? How do they do it? And the way that, places like Barnsley have to do it, or seemingly have to do it, is to develop those edgelands. In Barnsley's case, there's a lot of hub centres, there's a lot of distribution centres, there's a lot of service industry, and it's very attractive to boroughs when there's a new development in Barnsley with Hermes that offers 1,300 jobs on a huge swathe of land, which is very close to residential, but yet those jobs, how else do you create them? And that's the balance, I think, which all northern towns are probably having to strike. And it's in, I think, for us as artists and for myself, I find it an interesting subject. How does that affect then the community aspect? How does that affect the social aspiration of people? Does it? Are people more interested in developing an individual life than a community life these days? It's a balance which I think society kind of sometimes struggles to find.
The whole town has changed, but also beyond it being just about one town. I would like to think this exhibition can work if you're from Ashington or any town in the north, really, that you would find a similar set of circumstances, or even internationally. I mean, China has similar issues. I mean, you don't have the nuances of whether it's Northern England, but that idea of change and industrial change is a global thing, isn't it, really? How over a 50-year period a place can, lose an industry, gain new industries, and what that means to the physical makeup of a place. I think that's what's fascinated both of us, isn't it? The process of creating these artworks and working together is that it is very specific to both of us in terms of our locale, because we both live in Barnsley, but I would like to think it also has that international aspect to it, that this is not a one-off for Barnsley or the north of England. It kind of replicated globally. So I'm just looking at this image that's on the screen, that the way that the exhibition's laid out, on the right, you've got some work that represent the 90s. And then on the wall on the left, some Anton's photographs and some of my graphic work that that represent kind of where we're at now, you know, in terms of the change in landscape and prospects for people. And I think that's been really interesting, trying to garner that quantity of information over 50 years has been quite a challenge, I think, and trying to bring it together visually.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think we ever envisaged the exhibition as prescriptive. You know, it's something that we've placed work there, some archive work, some new work we've produced, some work kind of that was influenced by other projects we've done together, and tried to raise questions. I mean, I think we kind of not seen it on the images, but we end on a question mark, and I think, you know, that's important because really the answers to a lot of the questions that we're kind of posing, I suppose, aren't necessarily for us to answer and aren't necessarily for our generation to answer, but yet we have such a heavy influence on the, you know, future generation and the children that are coming up and how they see their areas, whether they stay in those areas. You know, there's a lot of movement, you know, in the modern world, not currently, but I'm sure hopefully we can get back to more travel. But the world feels smaller. It's strange that the world as a whole has felt smaller over preceding decades, but the pandemic has definitely had this effect that people are looking a bit more within, and kind of staying closer to home has given people a focus on their surroundings and the makeup of their surroundings and how they're used. And I think with a lot of this work, you follow your nose a little bit and hope that when you bring the work together, it will have a conversation with an audience. And I think for Patrick and I, that's certainly what we've tried to do with all the work we've done together, raise questions and opening discussions with an audience about the subject. And, you know, we spent probably 4 or 5 years working on related projects to this, and this is a culmination in a way of our thoughts and those discussions we've had with a lot of different organisations and partners, members of the public. I mean, we've had some great responses from students at the University of Sheffield about their experiences, and they come from a broad range of areas, you know, international students, students from kind of Manchester, the north, further north, south, and all of them have a strong connection now with the north, with the cities of the north and the towns of the north because of their lived experience. And I think those conversations are really important to shape how we see ourselves going forward.
I mean, this image that's on screen now, it shows how we've worked together in shaping the visual look of the exhibition. So here you can see how we've combined the photography on the walls, and we've also got elements of 3D work in the exhibition. So the large table in the middle of the room has probably hundreds of individual stories on there written by people about their thoughts and memories around the loss of the mining industry, and its place within the gallery runs from the 90s or the 80s and 90s. So if you're walking through the exhibition, it connects then to a contemporary northern town, which is where the Hope Neon is. So our hopes for the exhibition and for the north is that its future is open, really, and that's what we want people to interact with at the end of the exhibition, is your thoughts on what makes your northern town. But for us, it's kind of a journey that's gone from, you could say, community-driven, localized connections in the 60s through the period of industrial development and then a loss of industry. And then in this room that we're looking at now, there's kind of almost a wrestling really around what the territories are for anymore. And it's that change of use that's been really interesting to document and to share.
Yeah, I mean, there's good news stories in there as well in terms of the way the land has changed. For instance, in the Dearne Valley, which kind of connects, for those who don't know, it connects Barnsley with Rotherham, Doncaster. It's a huge swathe of land, which there's a huge kind of complex of mines there on land called Mambers. And that land, again, as Patrick mentioned, has got all these mixed-use sites. There's a lot of, initially there was a lot of prospective building, so warehouses which stayed empty for a while. Others were kind of obviously signed up for by big distribution companies. There's fast food outlets which are on the, and the strange element of it is the land has been reclaimed by nature in ways, in designed ways in some cases, and in natural ways in others. So, for instance, there's the Old Moor Wetland Centre, where incidentally they're filming Autumn Watch this week, and things like that didn't really stand a chance. The rivers didn't really stand a chance during mining, but they're now bringing salmon back into those rivers, and there are stories like that. And then you've got these housing estates, which are the entrance to the housing estate is a fast food outlet, and you kind of go, oh, okay, and it's that kind of so those fast food outlets become ingrained in the estate there. So you smell the fried chicken before you get to your house. Things like that is kind of a different way of being. You know, it's a some might say it's an American ideal, it's an American model, but you do get in other areas of Europe, and obviously this homogenized nature of the high streets, as once was, is now also happening in these areas. And then you also get areas, for instance, the Battle of Orgreave, the site where the Battle of Orgreave took place, is now the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, which produces high-end engineering and trains numerous kind of engineers and very successful businesses kind of working with McLaren and things like that. So there's a lot of mixed use, and it's really interesting how those things have developed. And I suppose all these areas, all these northern town areas, are competing for this funding, these businesses to come in, and trying to reinvent themselves still now, kind of into the next century.
Yeah, and I think there's a phrase that's almost been developed that responds to this particular location, and that's kind of post-traumatic landscapes. And I know that we've both done a project around that in Sheffield, but I think it's interesting here how the landscape's almost scarred from past industry, but then flowers grow, nature takes over, and the words on the table, I don't know if people can make them out, but it actually says bruised not broken, and that was partially related to communities in the north that from the 80s and 90s they suffered greatly, but there has been a kind of healing, and there also is still a rawness in some communities as well. The purpose of the exhibition in this room, the bruised not broken statement, it reads towards the hope. So as you physically walk through the exhibition, part of the 80s and 90s, it is really hard to look at almost, in terms of the impact on communities. And I don't think we've held back particularly from trying to represent that. And I think it is a journey, hopefully, towards, a brighter future. And these spaces will be reanimated for the good of, northern towns. But, in the news now, there's all the kind of talk of northern towns and cities and how there always seem to be a step behind the south in terms of, obviously now it's focused on the coronavirus funding, but just when you think there's a parity between north and south, there always seems to be something crops up that makes you fully aware that more from someone else's point of view than your own, maybe, that there is a negative perception still from the south. And certainly, as a town, Barnsley's had its funding decimated by, I think it was something like 40%, as of other northern towns. So it is a struggle, isn't it? I guess, still in northern towns, not just Barnsley, but hopefully, that there'll be a kind of parity and a brighter future, really, with future generations anyway.
Yeah, that's right. This kind of line, what must we dream of, which is kind of open-ended. It's kind of transposed onto one of these sites under development down in the Dearne Valley, and obviously you've got two in the background there. You can just make out there's two huge warehouse centres, and then there's this prepared land waiting for the next development in the foreground. And this statement, "What must we dream of?" ? It's kind of, so the councils obviously have a view of getting and developing the boroughs, using the devolution powers to bring in the funding to develop the boroughs in the best possible way to, get employment, and it's interesting to see, to view it from a long-term point of view as well as a short-term, and just say, okay, well, when these things are here, what's their lifespan? There's images earlier on in the exhibition that show the town centre in a stage in the 70s when it was kind of brutalist architecture, which a lot of towns had at that time and were kind of celebrated. And some have held on to, others have destroyed, and that brought in more modern development. Barnsley Town Centre is undergoing huge transformation at the moment in the same way. But this question of, if you bring in this funding and you have these devolution powers, then how do you use it? What's the overall plan? A lot of places have, these big investment plans, these big master plans that look to maybe a 10, 20-year cycle. It's quite interesting, having done this exhibition, to think, okay, what's the 50-year cycle? It's very hard to predict, but it's an interesting thought.
We've been asked to answer 3 questions by the Civic. So the first of these questions is, how is the creative process different working in a collaboration than as individuals? So I think that's a really interesting question. Do you want to try and answer that first, Anton?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really interesting to work in collaboration to get another perspective. I think so some of the work in the exhibition was created at different times, kind of in my working life. And some of it was created in isolation, in kind of, working on projects, self-funded projects, small ideas that I had that I wanted to develop. And then were brought into this kind of more collaborative process. And I think it's really interesting to kind of add those different ideas into a kind of a more collaborative way of working. And obviously the way I work is very different to the way Patrick works, and Patrick works with a lot of kind of graphic elements and kind of colour blocks and text and things like that, which is, the text element is probably something that we both do and combine together. So it was a nice crossover. And then it's interesting as an artist and someone who has always used photography. It's one of those processes where you can be very precious about the way you use the images. And to work with someone like Patrick, who manipulates images and cuts things and uses things a different way, it's quite a kind of a very interesting experiment for me to work in that way. And then obviously it comes down to ideas, and it comes down to the way that you think about the world, the way that your perspective is changed by someone else's experience, because everybody has their own personal experience and how they see the world. So I enjoy that kind of back and forth of ideas, and it kind of keeps you going on a project, when sometimes if you're working on something on your own, it might reach a conclusion before it really should. And working with someone else, you get that extra drive to push it through and kind of turn it into exhibitions and books and online materials. So it's a really interesting process.
The nice thing with this project is that we've probably been working on it for a long period now, certainly longer than most other projects. It's been a real discussion as well, and I think most of it has been a set of conversations that have then instigated actions afterwards, which is quite a nice way to work. I think it's quite refreshing for both of us, really, to have that, kind of a different way of thinking. And it sometimes helps in way of finding a way through, because this exhibition finds its way through 50 years, essentially, of change. So it's, the idea of creating work, but then also, working with archives, combining the two, tells a story, because I think this exhibition is all around trying to tell a story, but not just with one narrative. It's got many narratives. But so it's been refreshing, I think, working with another artist to sculpt these ingredients into what is Northern Town.
I
And we
think
have.
also, sorry, Paddy, I was just going to say, I mean, that even when working together, it's not in isolation, just the two of us either. We've worked with a lot of partners, both academic and archives and organisations that are based in certain areas. We work with the DVLP, the University of Sheffield. We've worked with the local archive group, Barnsley Archives and Local Studies, and it's just you kind of, I think you broaden out as you develop a project like this. You broaden out your scope, and certainly working together, you start feeding off other sides of it as well, and so you do almost like modules of the same project as you develop the ideas.
I remember the day where we went into the archive, and I think it was daunting in a way that I think there was probably about 1,000 images
At least.
in a folder, and if you're working on it as an individual, that would be a very daunting thing to have to physically go through all those. But I think we ended up taking it in turns to go through them and highlight images that might work, and that was a great example of how, I guess, trust comes into it to a degree, that you trust somebody else's opinion enough to be able to shape a project.
Should I ask the second question from that Civic proposed?
Mm-hmm.
So originally the exhibition was due to be installed in March. In fact, we were due on the very day that the staff had to go into furlough due to COVID. We were due to install that day, so it was postponed from March 2020, and then fortunately we were able to have the installation in October this year. And the question that they've asked is, obviously these are turbulent times for the whole country, and especially in the north of England with the recent kind of events. So the question is, has this changed your attitude towards the exhibition and the conversation around northern towns?
Well, I think it highlights just how relevant the exhibition is, really, and how, since we're talking about the coronavirus, it's the end of October now, and there's so much debate in the news now about the north and northern towns, and people like Andy Burnham making the point that the north will suffer with current levels of coronavirus funding. So in terms of whether the exhibition is still relevant, I think it's probably more relevant now. How we view the idea of the north or northern towns.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think it is a real test. If you look at it from a political point of view only, it's a real test for the devolution of power and how it works in reality. For the local city regions, how they develop, relationships, and particularly with certain political climates, whether they work better at certain times than others. It is a challenge. And it's been, like Patrick says right at the start there, it's really highlighted how these things still exist and are still relevant in the political landscape of today. And also, I guess, how people view their own place in those societies. So, yeah, I think it does affect it. I mean, there's a quote from Threads from Barry Hines' famous 80s nuclear story that kind of highlights how society is interdependent on itself, and how that's a strength and also a weakness. And that quote, you read it and it's chilling. It's chilling how relevant it is to this COVID situation. So I think it's highlighted it as more than changed the conversation, I think.
Outside politics as well, that it's an important survey, for want of a better word, that how northern writing and culture has impacted how the north viewed. A lot of the inspiration we've both had for the exhibition has, factored in these writers, whether it be Barry Hines, Keith Waterhouse, their contribution to how the north has almost shaped its own mythology of itself, especially in the 60s to 70s, and how that has gone on to impact later generations of creatives. So there's a lot of cross-reference lines from books that have turned into lyrics. So, from The Taste of Honey, you've got a lyric that Morrissey used in a song, and the Arctic Monkeys and Saturday Night, Sunday Morning. So strip all the politics out. I think what we've tried to work with as well is just how influential sort of some of that 60s and 70s thinking about representing a place has been, and it still is. There's a lot of good things there to revisit and turn into a fresh 21st century thinking and concepts around what the North is. It will always be relevant.
Absolutely.
So the last question is, what do you think makes Barnsley unique compared to other northern towns?
Wow, that's a can of worms. It's interesting. I was thinking about this, and I think it's easy for the national view of Barnsley to get wrapped up in a short period in time, when in the scheme of things, and the kind of militancy that is associated with NUM and the strength of the fight in the 80s. And I think it's taken a long, long time to shake any of that off. I think it's still really important to the town. I think that it's funny because I grew up on the outskirts of Sheffield, and I always identified with Sheffield as a kid. And it was only when I got to working age, I started working about 16, 17 in Barnsley, that I kind of got to know the town much better, and felt, more part of that side of where I came from. And I would always just reflect on the warmth of the people. It's kind of one of those places where you have to scratch the surface a bit to get to it sometimes, but it's kind of, there is that generosity of spirit which you don't get everywhere. But I think a lot of northern towns have that, but they have it in different ways. Some people are a bit more brusque, some towns are a bit more kind of judgmental, if that's the right word. But I think Barnsley's always been somewhere that doesn't necessarily judge as quick as some places. And it's interesting that in my introductory statement, I was thinking, like, how do I explain this to people? And it was strange that I never really thought about the fact I came from the north until I moved to the south to work when I was about 20. And all of a sudden I was a northerner. And that kind of idea of, oh, right, I'm a northerner, am I? Okay. Right. So I lived up to it a bit while I was there. And then when I came back, it stuck with me, and I started asking those questions more kind of to do with my work, and kind of how I identified as that, and how that affected me, and how it influenced me. So I think in terms of being unique, it's a fascinating place. I kind of still don't really understand it. Sometimes I love it, sometimes I hate it. I suppose it's the same for everybody. But yeah, I keep coming back. So there must be something decent about it.
Yeah, it is a very difficult question. I think my earliest memories of saying that you're from Barnsley, it was probably greeted with, "Oh, you're from Barnsley," and somebody did a really awful northern accent.
The bar would always, so if anybody says the town's name, it's got to have the bar.
Yeah, and
out with about 5 A's.
But what always surprised me was that some towns just have no response from people, because people just don't know where they are or what they're known for. But from being a child, I always, whenever we visited anybody from outside the area, they always knew about Barnsley, and I always thought that was interesting. Why did they know about it? And as you grow older, you think, well, why did they know about it? And I guess it was purely because of the industrial nature of it. I guess that's why it became, well, not necessarily famous, but known outside its borders. And yeah, I mean, it's an interesting place. I mean, when I grew up, which was on a council estate in Lumwood, it was a really fascinating place for me, in that just on our doorstep, we had a Cluniac Abbey, which is Priory Abbey, for those who know it. But you could literally walk from our back door and be in a totally different century. And for me, I think always at the back of my mind, outside all the mining and industry, has always been that idea of Barnsley having two points of view, really, two aspects to it that you could probably say is relatively unique. That it has a very industrial side of the town, where a majority of people would live, I would suspect. And then it has the other side of the town, which is more rural, more farmland. And you've got these two different communities that coexist. The word that you said, warmth, that people are generally warm and have a sense of humour. I know that exists everywhere, really, but I think that set of circumstances mark it out for me as being unique. Is that you've got two communities essentially that live together and kind of make the most of where they live. Going back to the idea of Kes and the landscape shown in that 50 years ago, they're still there and they're being much improved on. I mean, the cultural offer of Barnsley now is great. I mean, I remember as a child, there seems to be so many places that you could go now. The infrastructure of Barnsley from a cultural point of view is a lot stronger now, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Patrick. I'd agree with that. I mean, the Civic, just to blow the Civic's trumpet, some of the exhibitions that that they've put on over the years there, kind of international exhibitions of kind of importance. And very close by, you've got the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, which is kind of just outside the borough, but it's internationally known. And it's kind of, it's an amazing place. And so it is there, I think, for people to find. I mean, it's interesting you make that point about, Hines writing and Orchestral for a Knave, and the same. I mean, I grew up in a village called Wortley. It's in Wortley. There's Wortley Hall, which it's owned by the TUC, or was, and as a kind of place of rest for workers. It's a big stately home in a beautiful grounds, but it's got this dichotomy that it's actually for workers. So it's kind of you've got this kind of split personality. And I spent a lot of my childhood growing up in those grounds, and it's kind of, you feel a bit yourself like you've got a bit of a split personality because of that double-sided kind of existence of this big stately home, but it's for the people. It's not for the landed gentry. So it's just, these things kind of worm their way in, don't you? And that's what makes Barnsley unique. It's a double-sided coin.
Yeah, there's a no-nonsense approach, a practicality to things that, I'm trying to think from an artistic point of view that probably does feed into your work in some ways. Not that there's got to be a reason for doing something, because I don't think there has, in terms of creating art. You can just create anything you want, really. I think maybe, that idea of a practical side, and, if you're doing something, there's a function there to some degree. Maybe that has come from, living in a place that I do, and can't quite put my finger on what that is, but I think it has.
Yeah, 100%. And it's funny how, if you're talking about art and culture and the people that it's produced, there is a long line of great talent, and it's like, I'm interested. A friend of mine who I knew back when he was a student, who was an actor, and kind of he went on to great things, and now does loads of voiceovers because he's got this beautiful warm tone to his voice, even though it's been educated, if you like, into a bit more Queen's English. He's got this really rich tone to his accent, so he gets used for tons of, hear him all the time on the television with this rich tone. And then you got someone like Kate Rusby, who's great folk singer, Ian McMillan, known so widely and so celebrated, great orator, and it's an interesting mix of characters that have come from Barnsley. And there's sculptors like Graham Ibbison, who's internationally known, and whose work is, like you say, Patrick, it's very much ingrained in his upbringing, and his father was a miner, and that kind of influenced everything that he does. So I think I don't know many artists and creatives who aren't influenced by it. It's not like they just come from here. It is part of what they do, and that's quite unique.